Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight, we're embarking on a fascinating journey through the history of one of the most influential technology companies ever to exist. We're diving deep into the world of Nokia, a company that didn't invent the mobile phone but instead perfected it, democratized it, and fundamentally changed how billions of people communicate. For nearly 2 decades, Nokia dominated the mobile industry so thoroughly that their name became synonymous with the concept of a cell phone itself. In some parts of the world, people didn't say they were buying a phone, they said they were buying a Nokia. But this story is far more complex than simply being the best at what they did during a particular era. It's a tale of transformation, innovation, and ultimately, the crushing reality of technological disruption. To understand Nokia's place in history, we first need to understand the world into which mobile phones were introduced. In the 1970s and 1980s, telecommunications was dominated by massive infrastructure companies. The very idea of carrying a telephone in your pocket seemed like pure science fiction. Phones were attached to walls, desks, and vehicles. They were tethered by cables and copper wires to switching stations controlled by national governments and massive corporations. The first true mobile phones appeared in the 1970s, but they were nothing like what we know today. The Motorola DynaTAC, the world's first commercially available handheld cellular phone, debuted in 1973 and weighed approximately 2.5 pounds. It cost nearly $4,000 in today's money. It could barely hold a charge for an hour. It was a device designed for wealthy business people and emergency professionals. The thought of a teenager carrying one would have been laughable. The thought of a factory worker or a farmer owning one was incomprehensible. Mobile phones existed technically, but they were not yet part of the fabric of society. This is where Nokia's story becomes interesting. While other companies were content to serve the luxury market with heavy, expensive devices, Nokia was already thinking about scale, about efficiency, and about reaching ordinary people. The company had been around for over a century by the time mobile phones existed, and this longevity taught them something crucial. Technologies that seem revolutionary eventually become commonplace. The question is never whether something will be adopted widely, but how quickly you can make it affordable and reliable enough for mass adoption. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Nokia began positioning itself as a serious competitor in the mobile phone market. While companies like Motorola, Ericsson, and others focused on phones for professionals and wealthy individuals, Nokia was building manufacturing capacity, developing relationships with carriers, and most importantly perfecting the art of making phones that worked reliably, cost less than competitors' devices, and were designed with the ordinary person in mind. This strategic positioning would prove to be one of the most important business decisions in technology history. The mobile phone revolution didn't happen because engineers suddenly figured out how to make perfect phones. It happened because a company decided to make good enough phones and then made them systematically cheaper, smaller, and more reliable with each generation. Nokia understood this principle better than anyone else. While their competitors were measuring success in units sold to wealthy professionals, Nokia was measuring success in market penetration across entire populations. This fundamental difference in perspective shaped everything the company would do for the next 2 decades. By the late 1980s, the stage was set for mobile phones to transition from luxury item to consumer product. Cellular networks were becoming more widespread. Regulations were opening up to allow private competition in telecommunications, and consumer electronics manufacturing had improved to the point where building smaller, more efficient devices was economically feasible. Into this environment stepped Nokia. a company that had spent decades manufacturing electronics and understood the principles of scaling production, maintaining quality, and responding quickly to market demands. To fully appreciate how Nokia became the dominant force in mobile phones, we need to understand where the company came from. Nokia's origins trace back to 1865, when a company called Nokia was founded in Finland as a paper mill. Yes, you read that correctly. The company that would eventually define mobile communication began its life processing wood into paper. This isn't a trivial detail. The timber and paper industry taught Nokia principles that would later apply directly to mobile phone manufacturing. The paper mill business is fundamentally about processing raw materials efficiently, maintaining consistent quality across millions of units, and continuously improving processes to reduce costs while maintaining reliability. These aren't abstract business principles, they're concrete operational realities. When Nokia eventually diversified into other industries, including electronics, the company brought this manufacturing philosophy with them. They understood economies of scale, they understood how to streamline production, they understood quality control at scale. Most importantly, they understood how to gradually reduce costs while maintaining or improving product reliability. In 1960, Nokia merged with a rubber company and an electrical equipment manufacturer to form Nokia Corporation. This diversification into electronics was strategic. The company recognized that the future of industry lay in electronic devices and electrical systems, not in paper. Over the next 2 decades, Nokia built a respected reputation manufacturing telecommunications infrastructure. They made telephone switching systems, radio systems, and networking equipment. They weren't making phones yet, but they were building expertise in the communications business. This background in telecommunications infrastructure proved invaluable when Nokia eventually entered the mobile phone market. By the time the company decided to focus seriously on handheld mobile devices, they already understood how cellular networks worked, how different regions had different technical requirements, and how to interface with telecommunications companies around the world. Most phone manufacturers of the era had no such background. They were coming into the market from entirely different industries, which is why Nokia's advantage proved so decisive. In 1982, Nokia established a phone division specifically to develop mobile phones. This was a time when most observers still viewed mobile phones as niche devices. The market was so small that many established electronics companies didn't bother entering it seriously. Nokia's decision to commit resources to mobile phones was therefore a calculated bet on the future. The company believed that as networks improved and costs decreased, mobile phones would eventually become mass-market products. This belief, which seemed speculative at the time, would prove to be one of the most important strategic insights in business history. The early Nokia phones were large, expensive, and had significant limitations. But they were reliable, they worked across different networks, and they were built using manufacturing techniques that could be scaled up rapidly. Throughout the 1980s, Nokia continued refining their approach to mobile phone design and production. The company experimented with different form factors, different battery technologies, and different features. More importantly, they were learning how to bring manufacturing costs down with each new generation, while simultaneously improving battery life, durability, and user experience. One crucial aspect of Nokia's strategy during this period was their commitment to operating across multiple markets simultaneously. While some competitors focused primarily on North American markets, Nokia was building relationships with carriers and customers throughout Europe and Asia. This meant Nokia had to design phones that worked with different network standards, different frequencies, and different carrier requirements. This complexity was a burden in some ways, but it also gave Nokia invaluable experience in designing flexible, adaptable products. They learned how to build phones that could be modified relatively easily to meet different regional requirements. By 1987, Nokia had established itself as a significant player in the mobile phone market, though still far from dominant. The company was profitable and growing, but the market for mobile phones was still small. Something would need to change for Nokia to transition from a successful niche player to the industry leader. That something was the development of the GSM standard. GSM, or Global System for Mobile Communications, was a digital cellular network standard that offered significant advantages over the analog systems that had dominated the industry. Before we discuss the GSM revolution and how Nokia capitalized on it, we need to appreciate the state of mobile phones during the mid-1980s. This was the era of the brick phone, a term derived from the device's resemblance to actual bricks. These phones were typically 5 to 8 inches tall, weighed between 20 ounces and several pounds, and had a battery life measured in minutes, not hours. Using one of these devices in public was still an act of conspicuous consumption. It announced to everyone around you that you were wealthy enough to afford a telephone you carried with you. The Motorola Dynatac, which had dominated this market, was the phone of choice for business executives, celebrities, and wealthy individuals. It represented everything a mobile phone was at that time: heavy, expensive, and impressive. These early phones also had another characteristic that defined the era. They were connected to car power systems. The most common way to have a mobile phone in the early 80s was to have a car phone, a system permanently installed in your vehicle, often taking up the entire car's radio space. Car phones represented the first glimpse of the mobile phone industry as a mass-market phenomenon, but not in the way we usually think about it. Car phones were status symbols for business owners and wealthy individuals who could afford the $5,000 to $8,000 installation costs. They signaled success and importance. For the general public, however, car phones were exotic technology that they would never own. These phones were sold through car manufacturers and specialized installers, not through consumer electronics retailers. During this period, Nokia was making headway in the market, particularly in Europe. The company's phones were generally considered more reliable than the competition, and importantly, they cost slightly less. Nokia's focus on efficiency and manufacturing excellence meant that the company could offer phones with similar capabilities to competitors at lower price points. This strategy of offering comparable quality at lower prices would define Nokia's approach for the next 2 decades. It wasn't about being the fanciest or most feature-rich. It was about being the most reliable and most affordable. A crucial turning point came in 1991 when Finland became the first country to introduce a GSM network. GSM represented a revolutionary advance over the analog technology that had dominated mobile phones. Analog systems were unreliable, had poor sound quality, offered no privacy, and consumed enormous amounts of battery power. GSM was a digital system that was far more reliable, offered clear sound quality, and dramatically improved battery life. More importantly, GSM created a standardized platform that could be adopted internationally. For Nokia, GSM was a game-changing opportunity. The company had invested in GSM technology early, recognizing its potential to transform the industry. When Finland activated its GSM network in 1991, Nokia was ready with the Nokia 900, one of the first commercial GSM phones. This phone, compared to the brick phones of just a few years earlier, seemed like science fiction. It was smaller, lighter, had better sound quality, and most importantly, it could hold a charge for hours rather than minutes. The Nokia 900 wouldn't be remembered as the most iconic Nokia phone. That distinction belongs to other models. But it served a crucial purpose in Nokia's strategy. It proved that the company understood GSM technology deeply, could manufacture GSM phones reliably, and could bring them to market quickly. This early success with GSM positioned Nokia perfectly as the standard began spreading across Europe and eventually worldwide. While competitors scrambled to catch up, Nokia had a head start in manufacturing expertise and carrier relationships. Throughout the early 1990s, GSM networks continued spreading across Europe and into Asia. Different carriers activated networks at different times in different regions, but the overall trend was clear. GSM was becoming the dominant standard for mobile phones. This created an enormous advantage for companies like Nokia that had invested early in GSM technology and manufacturing. Companies that had focused primarily on analog technology found themselves scrambling to transition to digital systems, and this transition was far more disruptive than many of them anticipated. By the mid-1990s, the mobile phone market had fundamentally transformed. Phones were becoming smaller, lighter, cheaper, and more reliable. Battery technology was improving steadily. Manufacturers had figured out how to design phones with physical keypads that were satisfying to use. Carrier networks were becoming more widespread and more reliable. All these factors combined meant that mobile phones were beginning to transition from luxury items to consumer products that ordinary people could afford and use reliably. This transition would take place over the next 5 to 10 years, and Nokia was positioned to dominate this transformation. If there's one Nokia phone that represents the company's success in democratizing mobile communication, it's the Nokia 1100. Released in 2003, this phone sold over 250 million units, making it one of the best-selling mobile phones of all time. But the Nokia 1100 wasn't technologically revolutionary. It didn't have fancy features. It couldn't play music or display pictures in the way that more advanced phones could. Instead, the Nokia 1100 represented the perfection of a specific formula. A reliable, extremely affordable, durable phone that did exactly what ordinary people wanted a phone to do. The Nokia 1100 cost less than $100 when it was released, and in many developing countries it cost considerably less. It had a battery that could last days rather than hours. It had a speaker system that was loud enough to use outdoors without amplification. It had a physical keyboard that, while small, was satisfying to use. Most importantly, it worked reliably, often in environments with poor signal quality and environmental conditions that would destroy other phones. The Nokia 1100 became the choice of poor farmers in India, street vendors in Brazil, taxi drivers across Africa, and rural workers throughout Asia. To appreciate why the Nokia 1100 was so revolutionary, you need to understand what mobile phones meant in the early 2000s in developing countries. In 1995, mobile phones were vanishingly rare outside of wealthy urban areas in developed nations. By 2005, thanks largely to affordable phones like the Nokia 1100, mobile phones were becoming common among middle-class people in developing countries. The Nokia 1100 was a key driver of this transformation. The phone proved that there was an enormous market for affordable mobile phones. It also proved that Nokia understood that market better than any competitor. The success of the Nokia 1100 and similar budget phones represented a shift in how Nokia thought about their market. Rather than focusing primarily on wealthy business customers in developed nations, Nokia recognized that the future of mobile phones lay in bringing these devices to billions of people who had never owned one before. This required rethinking fundamental assumptions about phone design, manufacturing and distribution. It required accepting lower profit margins per unit in exchange for massive volume. It required understanding the specific needs and constraints of customers in different regions. The Nokia 1100 was specifically designed for developing markets. It had a very durable plastic construction that could withstand drops, dust, and humidity. It used minimal power, extending battery life to 3 or 4 days in standby mode. It had simple, straightforward software that didn't require users to understand complicated menus. It used the GSM standard that was being deployed throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. These design decisions sound obvious in retrospect, but at the time, most competitors weren't thinking about phones this way. They were still focused on adding features, making phones thinner, and targeting wealthy consumers. The Nokia 1100's release in 2003 coincided with a crucial moment in global telecommunications. GSM networks had been deployed throughout Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The phones were affordable enough for middle-class people in these regions, and carriers were aggressively marketing mobile services. The Nokia 1100 captured a moment when several trends intersected: falling phone costs, expanding networks, growing wealth in developing nations, and a genuine need for reliable communication technology in places where landline infrastructure was inadequate. The Nokia 1100's success wasn't just about the technical specifications, it was about understanding what people actually wanted from a phone. Market research showed that in many developing countries, the primary use for mobile phones wasn't calling friends and family for casual conversation. It was conducting business, managing supply chains, coordinating transportation, and maintaining emergency communication. The Nokia 1100 was optimized for these uses. It had excellent sound quality for business calls. It had text messaging that worked reliably even in areas with poor signal. It had software that was straightforward and didn't require constant recharging or complicated maintenance. Over the next several years, Nokia released numerous variants of the 1100 with different feature sets, different form factors, and different pricing. Some had built-in flashlights, some had multiple color options, some had improved cameras, but the core philosophy remained unchanged. Nokia was committed to making reliable, affordable phones that solved specific problems for specific customer segments. This approach proved phenomenally successful. By the mid-2000s, Nokia controlled over 35% of the global mobile phone market. The Nokia 1100 series also demonstrated Nokia's sophisticated understanding of supply chain and distribution networks. These phones were built to be sold through multiple channels: carrier stores, independent retailers, and online distributors. They were designed to be easy for retail staff to explain to customers. They were durable enough that they could be shipped through various supply chain systems without arriving damaged. They were simple enough that customers didn't need extensive training or support. These logistical advantages meant that the Nokia 1100 could be distributed and sold more efficiently than competitors' phones. By 2005, Nokia was the undisputed leader in global mobile phones. The company controlled the budget market with phones like the 1100. It controlled the mid-range market with phones that offered more features at moderate prices. It was beginning to develop phones that competed with premium manufacturers at the high end. Nokia wasn't just dominant in terms of market share. The company had established a reputation for reliability and quality that was difficult for competitors to challenge. When people thought about phones, they thought about Nokia. This dominance wasn't achieved through artificial means or market manipulation. Nokia had earned this position through years of consistent execution, smart manufacturing decisions, and a genuine commitment to understanding and serving customer needs. The company had factories in multiple regions. It had relationships with carriers throughout the world. It understood different regional preferences and technical requirements. It had invested in research and development to continuously improve phone technology. By the mid-2000s, Nokia had assembled an almost unassailable competitive position. While Nokia's domination of the budget and mid-range phone markets was creating the foundation of the company's enormous profits, something else was happening at the high end of Nokia's product line. The company had begun developing premium phones that competed directly with Sony Ericsson and other high-end phone manufacturers. These phones were called the N series, and they represented Nokia's vision of what premium mobile phones could become. The N series phones were notable for their advanced features, their stylish design, and most importantly their focus on integrating advanced technology and digital entertainment into a mobile device. The Nokia N95, released in 2006, became iconic as one of the most advanced mobile phones available at that time. The N95 was a pocket-sized computer that could do things that seemed almost impossible just a few years earlier. It had a 5-megapixel camera that could capture high-quality photos. It had a GPS receiver that could provide turn-by-turn navigation. It had a fast internet connection. It could play complex games. It could run multiple applications simultaneously. For tech enthusiasts and professionals, the N95 was a revelation. It suggested that mobile phones could become genuine computing devices rather than just communication tools. The N series represented a different strategy than Nokia's domination of the mass market. These phones were profitable on a per-unit basis because of their high price, but they also served a crucial strategic purpose. They demonstrated that Nokia could innovate at the highest levels. They showed that the company understood advanced technology and could implement it in consumer devices. They attracted developers who wanted to write applications for advanced phones. Most importantly, they created a halo effect that made all Nokia phones feel more advanced and prestigious than competitors' devices. The games on N-series phones deserve special mention because they were a significant part of these devices' appeal. The N95 and other N-series phones had gaming capabilities that were genuinely impressive. They could play 3D games with graphics that were remarkable for the time. They could run complex simulations. They could handle real-time multiplayer gaming over internet connections. For the first time, mobile phones weren't just communication devices or productivity tools. They were gaming platforms that could compete with dedicated gaming devices in terms of graphical quality and gameplay complexity. The N-series gaming capabilities were particularly significant because they demonstrated what was technically possible in a mobile phone. Game developers who created titles for N-series phones were learning to optimize graphics and gameplay for limited processing power and battery life. This knowledge would prove valuable when smartphones eventually became ubiquitous. The games also created a sense that Nokia phones were for people who cared about technology and design. This perception was crucial to Nokia's brand image. By the mid-2000s, Nokia had developed a complete product portfolio that served every market segment. Budget phones like the 1100 served customers who wanted basic mobile communication at minimal cost. Mid-range phones served people who wanted more features and better design without paying premium prices. The N-series phones served enthusiasts and professionals who wanted the most advanced technology available. This portfolio approach meant that Nokia could capture customers across the entire income spectrum and across different use cases and preferences. The N-series phones also represented Nokia's commitment to the Symbian operating system. Symbian was a sophisticated mobile operating system that Nokia and other manufacturers had developed as an alternative to the closed operating systems used in phones like the iPhone and Windows mobile devices. Symbian gave developers flexibility to create advanced applications. It allowed phone manufacturers to customize the user experience. It offered multitasking and sophisticated file management. For a period in the mid-2000s, Symbian seemed like it could become the dominant operating system for smartphones. The Nokia N-series success, combined with the company's domination of the mass market, created a situation where Nokia seemed almost untouchable. The company was profitable, innovative, growing, and expanding into new markets. Nokia wasn't just making phones. The company had expanded into gaming. It was developing navigation systems. It was exploring mobile internet services. For investors and industry observers, Nokia seemed like it could dominate mobile technology for decades to come. By 2007, when the first iPhone was released, Nokia controlled approximately 40% of the global mobile phone market. The company was generating enormous revenues and profits. Nokia had factories on multiple continents. It had relationships with every major carrier in the world. It had a diverse product line serving different market segments. It had invested heavily in research and development. The company had a well-established brand that consumers trusted. From every conventional perspective, Nokia should have been able to successfully transition to the smartphone era. The question that history would ultimately answer was whether conventional advantages were sufficient when facing a technological disruption as fundamental as the shift from feature phones to smartphones. Before we move forward to discuss Nokia's smartphone attempts and eventual decline, we need to spend significant time understanding one particular phone that became a cultural phenomenon and represents perhaps the most perfect expression of Nokia's design philosophy. The Nokia 3310, released in 2000, sold over 115 million units during its production run, making it one of the most successful mobile phones ever created. Unlike the 1100, which was specifically designed for developing markets, the 3310 was a global phenomenon that transcended regional economic and demographic boundaries. The Nokia 3310 cost around $300 when it was released in developed markets, but this price point didn't limit its popularity. The phone appealed to everyone from teenagers to business professionals. It became a symbol of reliability. It became a meme in internet culture. People who owned 3310s reported that they lasted for years without problems. The batteries still held charge. The physical buttons remained responsive. The phones could survive being dropped multiple times. The Nokia 3310 gained a reputation that bordered on legendary among certain online communities, which persist to this day. What made the Nokia 3310 special? From a technical perspective, the phone wasn't revolutionary. It had a small colour screen. It could send text messages and make calls. It had a basic music player. It could take very low-resolution photos. The camera was so poor that many people disabled it and used a different phone for photos. By the standards of the early 2000s, the 3310 wasn't cutting edge. It was a solidly mid-range phone. What made it special was something more intangible than specifications. The Nokia 3310 represented near-perfect industrial design within constraints. The phone was ergonomic. It felt good to hold and use. The physical keyboard was satisfying. The buttons were responsive. The screen, while small by modern standards, was bright and readable in outdoor conditions. The software was intuitive. There were no confusing menus. Everything the phone could do, users could figure out without extensive training or reading manuals. When companies design products, they often add features and complexity. The 3310 represented a different philosophy. It included only the features that users actually wanted, and it implemented those features extraordinarily well. The Nokia 3310 also benefited from something that's often overlooked when discussing product success. It was affordable enough for ordinary people, but expensive enough that it felt like a meaningful purchase. For a teenager, saving money to buy a 3310 was an achievable goal. For adults, it was affordable without being disposable. This price point meant that people took care of their phones, they bought protective covers, they were careful about dropping them. This careful treatment partly explains the phone's legendary durability. But the durability itself was real. Nokia's manufacturing quality meant that the 3310 could actually withstand years of use without degradation. The Nokia 3310 also became famous for a feature that now seems hilariously anachronistic. The phone came with a pre-installed game called Snake. This simple game, where a player controls a growing line that must eat dots and avoid colliding with itself, became one of the most played games of its era. Billions of people played Snake on the 3310. The game didn't require internet connectivity. It didn't require any setup. It was just there, ready to play whenever someone was bored or waiting. The simplicity of Snake mirrored the overall philosophy of the 3310. It did what it was supposed to do exceptionally well. The cultural impact of the Nokia 3310 extended far beyond mere sales numbers. The phone became aspirational in ways that had nothing to do with its technical specifications. In some developing countries, owning a 3310 signaled that you had achieved a certain economic status. It meant you had money for a reliable phone. In developed countries, the 3310 became a default phone for people who wanted something that worked without fuss. The phone appealed to people who were suspicious of complexity. It appealed to people who valued reliability over features. The Nokia 3310 also benefited from Nokia's global distribution network and carrier relationships. The phone was available almost everywhere phones were sold. It worked with every major carrier's network. It was offered at multiple price points through different retailers. This ubiquity meant that the 3310 wasn't just a good phone. It was the phone that was available when you needed a phone. When someone decided to buy their first mobile phone, or when someone's previous phone broke, the 3310 was often the most obvious choice. In many ways, the Nokia 3310 represented the pinnacle of Nokia's design and manufacturing achievement. The company had perfected the art of making a phone that appealed to billions of people. The 3310 proved that consumers didn't necessarily want phones packed with every possible feature. They wanted phones that worked reliably, were easy to use, and could fit in a pocket and last for days without recharging. For several years, the 3310 seemed to epitomize what mobile phones could and should be. The Nokia 3310 would continue selling for years after its initial release. The phone proved so popular that Nokia kept manufacturing it well into the smartphone era. When the company eventually discontinued the 3310, it was partly because smartphones were beginning to dominate the market, but also because Nokia needed to clear inventory and move customers toward newer products. The discontinuation was inevitable, but many people mourned it. Even as smartphones became ubiquitous, there were always people who wanted a phone like the 3310. That desire persists to this day, which is why Nokia released a 3310 remake in 2017, and why people continue discussing the original 3310 as one of the best phones ever made. As we entered the middle of the 2000s, the mobile phone industry was at a crossroads. The boundaries between mobile phones and personal computers were beginning to blur. Manufacturers realized that phones could be more than communication devices. They could become genuine computing platforms. Different companies took different approaches to this transition. Some, like Microsoft with Windows Mobile, attempted to port desktop operating systems to phones. Others, like Apple with the iPhone, created entirely new operating systems designed specifically for touchscreen mobile devices. Nokia, through the Symbian platform, was creating an operating system that tried to bridge these worlds. The Symbian operating system had a complex history. It was developed through a consortium of manufacturers including Nokia, Sony Ericsson and others. Symbian represented an attempt to create a universal mobile operating system that could be adapted by multiple manufacturers while maintaining compatibility across devices. For a period in the mid-2000s, Symbian seemed like a viable path forward. Nokia's commitment to Symbian through phones like the N95 demonstrated the company's confidence in this approach. The N95 was essentially Nokia's flagship smartphone before Apple released the iPhone. The Nokia N95 was genuinely impressive technology for 2006. The phone had a slide-out keyboard that revealed a full QWERTY layout for typing emails and text messages. The camera was 5 megapixels, which was remarkable for a phone at that time. The device had GPS built in, allowing for real-time navigation and location-based services. It had a fast internet connection through HSDPA technology. It could play music and video. It could run multiple applications simultaneously. The N95 proved that Nokia understood what advanced mobile devices needed to be. The problem was that the phone was expensive, complicated, and didn't appeal to mass-market consumers. Nokia had some significant advantages as the smartphone era approached. The company had established relationships with carriers worldwide. It had manufacturing expertise that competitors couldn't match. It had a brand that consumers trusted. It had enormous profits that could fund research and development. Nokia had proven it could design compelling devices that people wanted to use. By every conventional measure, Nokia should have been able to transition successfully to smartphones. What the company failed to anticipate, and what even most industry observers failed to anticipate, was how completely the smartphone market would be disrupted by the iPhone's approach. The Symbian operating system had significant technical merits. It was sophisticated and capable. It allowed for multiple simultaneous applications. It provided access to the file system. It offered capabilities that iOS originally didn't have. But Symbian had limitations that became increasingly apparent as time went on. The user interface was confusing to people unfamiliar with mobile computing. The operating system was resource-intensive, which meant devices running Symbian were less responsive than devices with simpler, more streamlined operating systems. The development environment for Symbian applications was more complex than the development environments for iOS or Android, which meant fewer applications were created for the platform. During the period from 2006 to 2008, Nokia continued releasing Symbian-based phones. The company was still profitable, still growing, and still shipping millions of phones every quarter. From Nokia's perspective, the transition to smartphones was proceeding according to plan. Advanced users were adopting N-series phones. The mass market was still buying 3310s and 1100s and other traditional phones. Nokia executives believed the company had time to transition the mass market to smartphones gradually, as prices fell and capabilities improved. What Nokia executives didn't fully appreciate was that the iPhone had fundamentally changed consumer expectations about what a smartphone should be. The iPhone was initially dismissed by many industry observers as a toy without a physical keyboard. Serious mobile workers, they argued, would never give up their BlackBerry or their Windows mobile device for a phone without a physical keyboard. This analysis failed to appreciate that the iPhone had created a new category of what was possible. The touchscreen interface was so intuitive that it didn't require users to memorize keyboard shortcuts or navigate complex menu hierarchies. The iPhone proved that regular consumers wanted smartphones, not just business professionals. By 2008, it was becoming clear that the smartphone market was going to evolve very differently than Nokia had anticipated. Apple had released the iPhone and the iPhone 3G. Google had released Android. These two platforms were rapidly gaining market share. The iPhone, despite its high price, was creating enormous profits for Apple. Android, through partnerships with multiple manufacturers, was rapidly spreading across the market. Symbian, which had seemed like a viable platform just a couple years earlier, was suddenly becoming a liability. Applications were increasingly being developed for iPhone and Android, not for Symbian. Developers were moving their efforts to the new platforms. Nokia's response to the smartphone revolution was complicated. The company had invested heavily in Symbian, and despite the platform's limitations, Nokia continued releasing Symbian-based phones. The company was making enormous profits from traditional phones, which created a disincentive to rapidly transition to a different platform. This is a phenomenon that economists and business historians have documented repeatedly. When a company is highly profitable in an existing business, the pressure to disrupt that business through new technology is less urgent than it should be. Nokia was making too much money from traditional phones to feel desperate about transitioning to smartphones quickly enough. By 2009 and 2010, it was becoming increasingly clear that Nokia had made a strategic error. The company should have either developed iOS internally or partnered with Apple far earlier. Alternatively, Nokia should have embraced Android, or developed its own competitive alternative much more quickly. Instead, the company remained committed to Symbian and the N-series phones, even as market share was shifting dramatically toward iPhone and Android devices. This wasn't because Nokia's executives were incompetent. It was because they were trapped by their own success. They had built the most successful phone company in history. Admitting that the strategy needed to change dramatically was psychologically difficult. The release of the iPhone in June 2007 was not immediately recognized as the cataclysmic event for the mobile phone industry that it actually was. Most observers, including many at Nokia, initially viewed the iPhone as a niche product for wealthy people who prioritized fashion over functionality. The lack of a physical keyboard seemed like a fundamental limitation. The price was higher than flagship phones from Samsung, Nokia, and other manufacturers. The original iPhone couldn't run third-party applications. It couldn't send multimedia messages. It couldn't even copy and paste text. From a features perspective, the original iPhone seemed inferior to phones that were already available. What made the iPhone revolutionary wasn't its features on a specification sheet. It was the user experience. Everything about the iPhone was designed to be simple and intuitive. The touchscreen interface worked differently than any phone had worked before. The screen was large, bright, and responsive. The interface had just a few buttons. Everything was accessible through the same touchscreen interface. Users didn't need to memorize keyboard shortcuts or navigate through nested menus. The iPhone felt different because it was designed from the ground up around what users actually wanted to do rather than what the technology could technically do. For Nokia, the iPhone wasn't initially perceived as a massive threat. After all, Nokia was selling over 100 million phones per year. The iPhone, in its first year, sold only about 1.4 million units. Nokia's market share actually increased during 2007 and 2008. The company was still the most profitable and most dominant phone manufacturer in the world. However, the iPhone's impact on the market was disproportionate to its sales numbers. Developers were flocking to create iPhone applications. The media was obsessed with the iPhone. Consumers, especially in developed countries, were becoming increasingly interested in iPhones. The launch of the App Store in July 2008 was the pivotal moment that Nokia's leadership should have recognized as an existential threat. The App Store made it trivially easy for developers to create applications, distribute them, and get paid for them. Within months, thousands of applications were available for the iPhone. This was a stark contrast to Symbian, where developing and distributing applications was far more complicated. The App Store created a positive feedback loop. More applications attracted more iPhone users. More iPhone users attracted more developers. Within a couple of years, the App Store had become the epicenter of mobile application development. Android, released in 2008 as well, faced initial skepticism similar to the iPhone. But Google's decision to make Android open source and free to manufacturers meant that companies like Samsung, HTC, and Motorola rapidly adopted the platform. Unlike Symbian, which Nokia controlled, Android was available to any manufacturer. This meant that Android devices could compete directly with iPhones on price and features without manufacturers having to create their own operating system. By 2010, Android was beginning to dominate the market in terms of market share, though the iPhone was far more profitable on a per-unit basis. For Nokia, the years from 2007 to 2010 represented a slow-motion collision. The company continued making phones that sold in enormous quantities. The company continued generating enormous profits. From a quarterly or annual perspective, Nokia's business seemed fine. What was changing, however, was the trajectory. Apple and Android manufacturers were capturing more of the smartphone market each quarter. As smartphone sales grew, traditional phone sales fell. Nokia had built its business on making traditional phones, and that market was rapidly shrinking. The company had a large Symbian presence in the smartphone market, but Symbian was rapidly losing ground to iOS and Android. During this period, Nokia did attempt to respond to the smartphone threat. The company released the N97 in 2009, which was an evolution of the N95 with improved features and capabilities. The phone had a slide-out keyboard like its predecessor. It had improved performance and a larger screen, but the N97 was expensive and still faced the same user interface challenges that plagued all Symbian phones. The software felt clunky compared to iOS. The performance was sluggish. Developers were continuing to move away from Symbian. The N97 sold reasonably well by some standards, but it never captured the enthusiasm that iPhones generated among consumers and developers. Between 2008 and 2010, Nokia's market share began to decline in absolute terms, not just relative to competitors. The company that had controlled 40% of the global phone market in 2007 saw its market share drop to 35% by 2009 and further by 2010. For a company so accustomed to growth and dominance, this decline was psychologically difficult to accept. However, the worst was yet to come. In the following years, as smartphones rapidly became dominant and traditional phones became obsolete, Nokia's market share would plummet even further. The fundamental problem with Nokia's position was that the company had optimized itself to be the best at making traditional phones. Nokia's manufacturing excellence, supply chain optimization, and cost reduction strategies were all based on making feature phones. As the market shifted to smartphones, these advantages became irrelevant. Nokia had built factories optimized for producing millions of simple phones. The company had supply chains optimized for distributing basic phones globally. When the market demanded sophisticated mobile computers, Nokia's greatest strengths became liabilities. In hindsight, what Nokia needed to do was clear. The company needed to abandon Symbian and adopt either iOS or Android. If the company had adopted Android in 2008 or 2009, the transition might have gone differently. Nokia had the manufacturing expertise, the carrier relationships, and the brand trust that could have made Android devices that competed effectively with Samsung and other manufacturers. Instead, Nokia remained committed to Symbian and the strategy of developing its own ecosystem. The human element of Nokia's decline shouldn't be overlooked. Nokia's executives were brilliant people who'd built an extraordinarily successful company. They'd made the right decisions for decades. When those same executives argued that Symbian was a viable platform and that Nokia should continue betting on the company's own technologies, they weren't being irrational. They were extrapolating from their own success. They were trusting their track record and their judgment. The problem was that the world had fundamentally changed, and the skills and instincts that had made Nokia successful in one era were not the skills needed to succeed in a new era. By 2010, it had become impossible to deny that Nokia was in serious trouble. The company's smartphone market share was negligible. Android devices were proliferating. iPhones were gaining traction. Symbian was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Market observers were questioning whether Nokia could survive as a standalone company. The company had been the world's dominant phone manufacturer, and now it seemed possible that within a few years, Nokia might cease to exist as an independent entity. This was a humbling realization for a company that had been so successful for so long. In early 2011, Nokia announced a major strategic shift. The company would abandon Symbian and partner with Microsoft to develop phones using the Windows Phone operating system. This decision was announced by Nokia's new CEO, Stephen Elop, who had joined the company from Microsoft in late 2010. The partnership with Microsoft was presented as the solution to Nokia's problems. Windows Phone represented a sophisticated mobile operating system with a unique user interface that differentiated it from both iOS and Android. By partnering with Microsoft, Nokia would benefit from Microsoft's investment in operating system development, while Nokia contributed its manufacturing expertise and carrier relationships. The announcement of the Windows Phone partnership was received with mixed reactions. Some industry observers saw it as a bold move that could revitalize Nokia. The argument was that by partnering with Microsoft, Nokia could focus on what it did best, which was making excellent hardware, while Microsoft handled the software. Others saw the decision as a desperation move that would only delay Nokia's decline. They pointed out that Windows Phone had not gained significant market share. The operating system had very few applications compared to iOS and Android. Most importantly, Nokia was essentially admitting that Symbian had failed and that the company couldn't compete with iOS and Android independently. The Nokia N900, released in November 2010, was the final phone Nokia made running Symbian. The device was technically impressive and represented the height of what Nokia could achieve with Symbian. It had a slide-out QWERTY keyboard, a large bright screen, and sophisticated software. But the N900 was the last gasp of Symbian, not the beginning of a new era. The phone sold poorly. Developers and consumers were moving to iOS and Android. The message was clear. Nokia's attempt to build its own ecosystem around Symbian had failed. The transition from Symbian to Windows Phone was technically and operationally complicated. Nokia had to build manufacturing expertise for a new platform. The company had to work with Microsoft to customize Windows Phone for Nokia's hardware. The company had to negotiate with carriers to get Windows Phone devices into distribution networks that had previously been dominated by iOS and Android phones. This transition was expensive and time-consuming. It also consumed management attention and resources that could have been directed toward other initiatives. Nokia's first Windows Phone device was the Nokia Lumia 800, released in November 2011. The phone was stylish and represented a departure from Nokia's previous N-series design language. The Lumia used Microsoft's distinctive Metro interface with large, colourful tiles instead of traditional app icons. The phone had excellent build quality and a premium feel. In many ways, the Lumia represented the best of what Nokia and Microsoft could create together. However, the phone faced an uphill battle in a market dominated by iOS and Android. The Lumia line continued expanding with new models released throughout 2012 and 2013. The Lumia 920 was released in 2012 and represented an evolution of the line with improved features and performance. These phones were generally praised by reviewers for their design and hardware quality. The Windows Phone software was increasingly seen as an underrated platform with unique capabilities and a compelling user interface. However, none of this mattered in the face of the fundamental problem that Windows Phone was not iOS or Android. The vast majority of applications available on iOS and Android were not available for Windows Phone. This meant that no matter how good Nokia's hardware was, users were choosing iPhones and Android phones because of the ecosystem. The Windows Phone partnership represented Nokia's last desperate attempt to remain relevant as a smartphone manufacturer. The company invested heavily in the Lumia line. Marketing budgets were increased significantly. Nokia attempted to create premium phone experiences that would compete with the iPhone. None of these efforts were sufficient to overcome the fundamental disadvantage that Windows Phone occupied in the market. By 2013, it was becoming clear that the Windows Phone experiment was failing. During the period from 2011 to 2013, Nokia's financial situation continued deteriorating. The company had once been the world's most profitable phone manufacturer, generating tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue. Now the company was losing money. The transition from feature phones to smartphones had destroyed Nokia's business model. The transition from Symbian to Windows Phone had consumed enormous resources. The company's manufacturing capacity, once its greatest advantage, had become an enormous fixed cost liability. When demand for Nokia phones fell, the company still had to pay for factories and employees. By 2013, Microsoft and Nokia announced that Microsoft would acquire Nokia's phone division. The Finnish company would not simply be purchased as a whole. Instead, Microsoft would buy the phone-making division, the brand and the patents, while Nokia as a company would continue existing but would focus on completely different business areas. This acquisition was the final statement that Nokia as a phone manufacturer had ceased to exist. The phones that might be released under the Nokia brand in the future would be Microsoft products, not Nokia products. The Microsoft acquisition was completed in 2014, but by that time the Windows Phone market share was negligible and continuing to shrink. Microsoft continued making phones using the Windows Phone brand for several more years, but the effort never succeeded. By 2017, Microsoft formally discontinued development of Windows Phone. The company had recognized that the platform couldn't compete with iOS and Android. With Windows Phone's discontinuation came the final end of Nokia's existence as a phone manufacturer. The brand would continue to exist in limited forms, eventually licensed to other companies making Android phones. But this was no longer Nokia's core business. After Microsoft acquired Nokia's phone division in 2014, the story of Nokia phones didn't end entirely. Instead, it transformed into something very different. Nokia as a company continued to exist, now focused primarily on telecommunications infrastructure and networking equipment. However, other companies realized that the Nokia brand still carried significant goodwill and prestige among consumers, particularly in developing markets where Nokia phones had been so dominant. This led to a new chapter in Nokia's phone story, one where the company licensed its name and brand to manufacturers who would create Android phones under the Nokia label. The first significant effort in this new era came when HMD Global, a Finnish company, began producing Android phones under the Nokia brand in 2016. This partnership represented a different business model than what Nokia had done in the past. Rather than manufacturing phones itself, Nokia was licensing its brand and intellectual property to another company. The phones would run Android, Google's operating system that had dominated the smartphone market. This was, in some ways, an admission of the old strategy's failure, but it also represented a pragmatic solution to keeping the Nokia brand relevant and generating revenue from it. HMD Global's first Nokia Android phone was the Nokia 6, released in early 2017. The phone was released first in China and later expanded to other markets. The Nokia 6 represented an attempt to recapture some of Nokia's old glory by creating a phone with premium build quality and clean software. The device had a metal frame and glass back. It ran Android with minimal customization, which appealed to people who preferred pure Android experiences without manufacturer bloatware. The phone was priced to be competitive in the mid-range market segment, similar to where many of Nokia's most successful phones had been positioned. The Nokia 6 was received reasonably well by consumers and reviewers. The phone had good performance, excellent build quality, and a clean software experience. However, the market had changed dramatically since the days when Nokia dominated phones. The smartphone market was mature and highly competitive. Companies like Samsung, Apple, Xiaomi and others had established strong positions. The Nokia 6 couldn't compete on features or price against these competitors. The only advantage Nokia had was its brand legacy and nostalgia. For many consumers, especially those who'd owned Nokia phones in the past, this was enough to create interest. However, interest alone wasn't sufficient to create the kind of market dominance that Nokia had once enjoyed. Following the Nokia 6, HMD Global released several other Android phones under the Nokia brand. The Nokia 3, Nokia 5 and Nokia 7 created a product line at different price points. Higher-end models like the Nokia 8 were released to compete in the premium segment. These phones were generally well-designed and competently manufactured, but none of them achieved the kind of market success that would restore Nokia to its former position. The fundamental problem was that the smartphone market had become a commoditized business, where brand heritage mattered far less than features, price, and carrier relationships. One notable phone in the modern Nokia line was the Nokia 3310, a remake of the legendary feature phone released in 2017. This was a symbolic gesture that acknowledged Nokia's heritage and the cultural significance of the 3310 among consumers. The remake was a modern reinterpretation of the original design, running a simplified version of the Android operating system called Android Go. The phone targeted the budget market segment and represented an attempt to recapture some of the magic of the original 3310. The remake was received with nostalgia and curiosity, but it struggled to find a viable market position in an era when basic smartphones were becoming increasingly affordable. The modern Nokia Android phones have occupied a strange position in the market. They're not industry leaders in any particular category. They're not the most feature-rich. They're not the cheapest. They're not particularly fashionable. What they are is competent phones with clean software, decent build quality, and the Nokia brand. For certain customer segments, particularly those who have existing loyalty to the Nokia brand or nostalgia for the company's past products, this is sufficient. Nokia phones have maintained a modest market presence in various regions, particularly in India and other developing countries where the brand still carries weight. The licensing model that HMD Global has used with Nokia is quite different from the traditional phone manufacturing business that Nokia operated for decades. Under this model, Nokia doesn't bear most of the research and development cost for new devices. It doesn't own the factories where phones are manufactured. It doesn't have to establish distribution relationships with carriers. Instead, Nokia essentially licenses its brand and receives a percentage of revenues from phones sold. This model is far less risky and far less capital intensive than traditional phone manufacturing. However, it also means that Nokia has much less control over product strategy and product quality. By the 2020s, Nokia had established itself as a niche player in the smartphone market. The company maintained a modest presence with budget and mid-range Android phones. The Nokia brand still conveyed a sense of reliability and durability to consumers, even if the company no longer manufactured phones itself. Nokia smartphones were particularly popular in developing markets where the brand heritage and reputation for quality remained strong. However, as a percentage of global smartphone shipments, Nokia phones represented less than 1% of the market. The company that had once controlled 40% of the global phone market had become almost irrelevant in terms of market share. This doesn't mean that the modern Nokia phones are failures. Many reviewers and users have praised specific models for their clean software, good build quality, and reasonable pricing. The Nokia 7.1, Nokia 6.1, and other models have been competently designed and manufactured. What has changed is the context. In an era when smartphone markets are saturated and consumers have dozens of viable options at every price point, being competent is insufficient. You need to be exceptional, or you need to have compelling features that differentiate you from competitors. Nokia in the modern era has neither, which is why the company has become a marginal player rather than a leader. The irony of Nokia's position today is profound. The company's greatest advantage during its feature phone era, world-class manufacturing and supply chain expertise, has become largely irrelevant in the smartphone age. The company's brand, which was once so powerful that people called all phones Nokias, is now viewed as a legacy brand that appeals primarily to people nostalgic for the past. The technologies that Nokia invested in, like Symbian, proved to be dead ends. The company's attempts to adapt, including the partnership with Microsoft, failed to preserve Nokia's market position. Despite Nokia's decline as a phone manufacturer, the company's legacy in mobile technology and consumer electronics remains profound. Nokia fundamentally changed how people communicate. Before Nokia's mass-market dominance, mobile phones were luxury items. After Nokia's success, mobile phones became as common as wristwatches. This transformation happened over approximately 2 decades, from the mid-1980s until the mid-2000s. Nokia was the primary driver of this transformation, not because the company invented mobile phones, but because the company understood how to make them affordable, reliable, and desirable to ordinary people. The Nokia 3310 and similar phones became cultural icons that persist in popular memory decades after their release. These phones represent a particular era when mobile technology was simple, reliable, and focused on core functionality. In an age when smartphones have become increasingly complex and feature-rich, there's nostalgia for phones that did one thing well: they worked. This nostalgia is partly based on genuine product quality, but it's also based on the fact that those phones represented a transitional moment in human communication. Mobile phones changed human behavior and society, and Nokia phones were the vehicles through which that change occurred for billions of people. Nokia's influence on industrial design is also significant. The company pioneered the aesthetic of mobile phones that became ubiquitous. The candy bar shape, the form factor that dominated from the 1990s through the 2000s, was popularized by Nokia. The durability and reliability that Nokia phones were known for set expectations for consumer electronics. The company's commitment to user experience, before that term was even widely used in technology circles, influenced how other manufacturers approached phone design. Even today, when smartphones look completely different from phones of the Nokia era, echoes of Nokia's design philosophy can be found in companies' commitment to reliability, durability, and user-friendly interfaces. The business model that Nokia pioneered, where a single company could dominate a technology market through superior manufacturing, supply chain efficiency, and understanding of customer needs, became a template that other companies tried to replicate. Companies like Samsung and Xiaomi studied Nokia's approach and applied similar principles to their own businesses. The model was so successful that it persisted even as the technology changed. What changed was the competitive dynamics. In the feature phone era, it was possible for one company to be so dominant because the product was relatively simple and the market boundaries were clear. In the smartphone era, competition became far more intense, and it became impossible for one company to maintain such dominance. The Nokia story is often presented as a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and the necessity of adaptation in technology markets. Business schools use Nokia as a case study in strategic failure. The company had every advantage. It was profitable, innovative, had established relationships with carriers, had strong manufacturing capabilities, and had a trusted brand. None of these advantages were sufficient to maintain market leadership in the face of the smartphone disruption. This story demonstrates a principle that has become increasingly important in the technology industry. Even companies that dominate their markets can be displaced surprisingly quickly when fundamental technological shifts occur. However, this reading of Nokia's decline as purely a failure of strategy misses important nuances. Nokia's executives were not incompetent. They faced genuine dilemmas. The company's core business was enormously profitable. Attempting to disrupt that business by aggressively moving to smartphones before the market was ready would have been risky. Shareholders and board members would have questioned such a strategy. Nokia's decline wasn't simply about bad decisions. It was about the company being trapped between its past success and an uncertain future. Nokia's impact on developing countries deserves special mention. The company's affordable phones enabled billions of people in developing nations to access mobile communication for the first time. This had enormous social and economic consequences. Small business owners could coordinate with suppliers and customers more efficiently. Farmers could check market prices before going to market. Families separated by migration could stay in contact. The democratization of mobile communication that Nokia phones enabled was one of the most significant technological developments of the late 20th century. The engineering and manufacturing excellence that Nokia developed over its history didn't disappear when the company exited the phone business. The company retained these capabilities and applied them to other areas. After selling its phone division to Microsoft, Nokia refocused on telecommunications infrastructure. The company's expertise in building reliable, efficient systems was applied to 5G networks, 4G infrastructure, and other telecommunications technology. In this area, Nokia has remained a significant player. The company that couldn't compete in the consumer smartphone market has remained a competitive and profitable supplier of telecommunications equipment to operators around the world. The symbolic importance of Nokia's decline shouldn't be understated. Nokia represented the era of Japanese and European manufacturing dominance that characterized the late 20th century. The company's decline coincided with the rise of American technology companies, particularly Apple, and Chinese technology companies, particularly Huawei and Xiaomi. This shift in global technology leadership was as important as the shift from feature phones to smartphones. Nokia's story is part of a larger narrative about how technological leadership shifted from Europe to the United States to Asia over a period of several decades. The loyalty that Nokia customers displayed, even after the company ceased being a major player, reveals something interesting about consumer psychology and brand loyalty. People who owned Nokia phones decades ago often express affection for those devices. This affection is not purely nostalgia. It reflects genuine positive experiences with reliable, durable devices. When HMD Global began manufacturing Nokia Android phones, the company was banking on the hope that this goodwill could be converted into sales. To some extent, it worked. Nokia phones found enough customers to remain a viable business, even if not a dominant one. As we reflect on the complete history of Nokia phones, several important themes emerge. First, Nokia demonstrated that in technology markets, understanding manufacturing and supply chains can be as important as understanding technology itself. Nokia didn't invent mobile phones, other companies did, but Nokia understood how to manufacture them efficiently, how to distribute them globally, and how to continuously reduce costs while maintaining quality. This expertise allowed Nokia to dominate a market that others had pioneered. Second, Nokia's story demonstrates the importance of early positioning in markets that have high capital requirements and network effects. By investing in GSM technology early and establishing relationships with carriers, Nokia created barriers to entry that competitors couldn't easily overcome. When the smartphone era arrived, these same barriers were irrelevant. The network effects in the smartphone market were driven by software ecosystems, not by carrier relationships or manufacturing expertise. Nokia's old strengths became irrelevant when the nature of competition fundamentally changed. Third, Nokia illustrates the danger of being trapped by past success. The company made enormous profits from feature phones. These profits created incentives to maintain the existing business rather than disrupt it. They also created organizational inertia. Thousands of employees were deployed in manufacturing, supply chain, and customer service roles, optimized for the feature phone business. Asking these people to radically change what they did or to support strategies that might cannibalize the existing business was difficult, even when intellectually it might have been the right thing to do. Looking forward, the question of whether Nokia phones will ever regain any significant market presence is uncertain. The smartphone market is mature and dominated by Apple, Samsung, and various Chinese manufacturers. These companies have enormous resources, well-established brand identities, and strong relationships with carriers and distribution channels. For Nokia to regain significant market presence would require either a fundamental shift in how mobile phones work, such as a transition to a new technology that Nokia understands better than competitors, or a reposition of the Nokia brand that seems unlikely given current market dynamics. The modern Nokia phones running Android represent a viable business for HMD Global. but they're unlikely to become dominant or even particularly significant in market share terms. The licensing model is profitable and allows Nokia to generate revenue from its brand without the risks and capital requirements of actually manufacturing phones. This is probably the realistic future for Nokia in the smartphone market. The company will be a niche player, valued primarily by consumers nostalgic for the brand's past or in specific geographic markets, where the brand retains particular resonance. What remains clear is that Nokia's achievements in the feature phone era represent one of the most remarkable success stories in technology history. The company took a business that seemed destined to remain a luxury niche and transformed it into a mass-market phenomenon used by billions of people. Nokia phones enabled communication technology to become democratic. They became tools that farmers and fishermen and factory workers used daily. They became cultural icons that people around the world recognized and understood. For a period of approximately 2 decades, Nokia was the company that controlled mobile phones. This dominance is gone, but the legacy persists. The story of Nokia also reminds us that technology markets are never permanently settled. Companies that seem utterly dominant can be displaced surprisingly quickly. The capabilities that make a company successful in one era may become liabilities in the next. Innovation and adaptation matter tremendously. So does luck and timing. Nokia was fortunate to be well positioned when GSM networks began deploying. Apple was fortunate that touchscreen technology became manufacturable and affordable at the exact moment when computer processors became powerful enough to handle sophisticated operating systems on mobile devices. For students of technology history and business strategy, Nokia's rise and fall represents an invaluable case study. The company demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of strategic excellence. Nokia proved that rigorous attention to manufacturing, supply chain optimization, and customer needs could create extraordinary dominance in a market. The company also demonstrated that this dominance is fragile and can be undermined by fundamental technological shifts and competitive strategies that compete on different dimensions than where the incumbent is strongest. As mobile technology continues to evolve, it's worth contemplating what comes next. Will smartphones be eventually replaced by another technology? Augmented reality glasses, neural interfaces, brain-computer interfaces? If such transitions occur, the question of which companies will dominate the new technology is wide open. History suggests that incumbents have significant disadvantages in radical technological transitions. Nokia itself emerged as a leader in mobile phones partly because the company was willing to enter a market that established leaders didn't take seriously. If another fundamental shift in mobile technology occurs, the company that dominates it might be a company we haven't heard of yet, just as Nokia eventually came to dominate mobile phones, despite starting from outside the telecommunications industry. The dream of many Nokia enthusiasts is that the company could somehow regain significant market presence through some combination of innovation, strategic positioning, and capitalizing on its brand heritage. The Nokia 3310 remake was partly driven by this dream. The assumption is that consumers who loved Nokia phones in the past might return to the brand if the company made excellent products. However, the smartphone market has proven remarkably resistant to disruption by incumbents or legacy brands. The companies that have succeeded in smartphones have been either companies with completely new approaches to computing, like Apple, or companies willing to embrace open platforms and compete on cost, like various Android manufacturers. The reality is that the Nokia phone story, at least the chapter about Nokia being a dominant or even significant player in the market, is almost certainly closed. The licensing of the Nokia brand to manufacturers like HMD Global is the likely future. The brand persists as a niche player, appealing to consumers who value Nokia's heritage or prefer clean Android software. This is not the future that Nokia's executives imagined when the company dominated the global mobile phone market. It's not even the future that seemed possible in 2010 when Nokia was still a top 3 global phone manufacturer. But for a company and a brand to persist in any form in a market as dynamic and competitive as smartphones represents a certain kind of success, even if it's vastly different from what came before. As our journey through Nokia's history concludes, we're left with a complex picture. Nokia achieved something remarkable in transforming mobile phones from luxury items to mass-market commodities. The company demonstrated extraordinary manufacturing excellence and customer understanding. Nokia phones became part of the fabric of global society. But Nokia also serves as a reminder that market dominance in technology is temporary. Today's leader becomes tomorrow's cautionary tale if the company cannot adapt to fundamental change. The question for Nokia now is whether the company's brand heritage and the current licensing arrangements can sustain a viable business for years to come, or whether the Nokia phone is ultimately destined to become merely a historical artifact, remembered fondly by people who lived through the feature phone era. The night grows long, and we've travelled far through the history of mobile communication. From the earliest brick phones to the dominance of GSM to the meteoric rise of the smartphone, Nokia was present at every major transition. The company helped shape the mobile world that most of us now take for granted. Thank you for drifting through this history with me. The story of Nokia phones is ultimately a story about innovation, adaptation, and the eternal truth that in technology, nothing dominates forever. Now, rest. Close your eyes. Let sleep carry you into dreams of a world of infinite connection, and remember that somewhere, someone is probably still using a reliable Nokia phone, keeping alive a legacy that once changed the world.